Hello and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be continuing our primary coverage of the 2022 primary elections ahead of November, and we're going to be zeroing in on a number of races in which Democrats have put a lot of money behind certain Republican contenders in order to try and get them the nominations in the hopes that they will be easier to beat come the November election. So this isn't a strategy that's employed exclusively by Democrats. Republicans have done this as recently as the Ohio Senate primary with Shontel Brown and Nina Turner. I forget which district that is, but it's the Cleveland district. We saw it in North Carolina where a Republican organization was running ads for Erica Smith, the more progressive Democrat, against Cal Cunningham in that primary, who, if Erica Smith had won the nomination, she probably would have lost by a larger margin than Cal Cunningham in the general. So, this isn't exclusively a Democrat or Republican strategy, but Democrats in particular have been really using this strategy in the 2022 midterms, knowing that it's probably not going to be a good year for them. So the states that we've seen this, Pennsylvania, we've already seen this happen. Josh Shapiro put a lot of money into Doug Mastriano's primary campaign. He was running ads for him saying that he was Trump's pick. He was the best choice, the most conservative Republican, the most Trump loyal, etc. Things that would excite the Republican base and get them to come out and vote for him. The Shapiro ads certainly had a huge impact in propping up Mastriano in the primary and making him the front runner, but there were other factors as well, and we'll talk about that later on in this video. You also saw this in California, particularly in the 21st District with David Valadao. He was being challenged from the right. Democrats actually donated to his challenger, and they basically highlighted the fact that David Valadao is an impeachment Republican. But David Valadao is running in a very blue district. He's running currently in a district that Biden won by 13 points. Now, this is an area where the Democrats actually failed. David Valadao has advanced to the general election in California's weird primary system, but it was close. It was only by a couple of points. So the Democrats really did some damage on David Valadao, which again, some would argue he has more of an excuse to vote the way he did because he's in a very blue district as compared to other Republicans. So we'll take a look. These are two examples where the Democrats have already done this. We're also going to take a look at Colorado and Illinois, two states where they're actively propping up certain candidates. In Colorado, they're trying to prop up Ron Hanks, who is sort of a Lauren Boebert type of Republican in terms of the issues he focuses on. Extremely right-wing, very vocal about, more unpopular opinions on the right, especially when it comes to a blue state like Colorado. And then in Illinois, you have Democrats propping up, I think his name is Darren Bailey, who is a very conservative Republican, would never win in a general election in a state as blue as Illinois. Republicans had a very moderate former Democrat, I think, running, who originally was leading the Republican primary ticket, was propped up by a couple of Republican billionaires because he could actually win in the state. But the Democrats are kind of actively trying to change the outcome in that primary as well. So we'll get into all of those races, but first, please consider subscribing down below if you're new, liking this video down below. I make political content like this all the time, election predictions and analysis, so please, if you're new, consider doing that and sharing this video. It really helps out the channel, and it helps me make more videos like these. So let's get straight into it. So first we'll start off with the race in Colorado, because I think this one is one of the more consequential races where Democrats are actively trying to prop up a certain Republican. So in Colorado, you have a Senate race that, as of right now, a lot of pollsters are putting at as likely or lean Democratic. You have one safe, which I don't buy at all. This is going to be a red wave year. So Republicans are going to do better in Colorado. But the question is, will they be able to win? As of right now, most people lean towards no, but they're likely to get it within a couple of points. And that's what's getting Democrats a bit nervous, because Joe O'Dea, the leading Republican candidate, is basically a generic Republican. On the issue of abortion, he's focusing more on late-term abortion instead of outright banning abortion, things like that. So he's doing, the sort of Youngkin strategy in Colorado. He has conservative opinions, but he's not putting them at the forefront of his campaign because he actually wants to win statewide. Ron Hanks is the opposite. He's running a very stop the steal kind of campaign, of sort of, the politics of Lauren Boebert and stuff like that, which would never work statewide in Colorado. But that's why Democrats are propping him up, because they know that Ron Hanks wouldn't win in a general election against Michael Bennet. Joe O'Dea has a shot. He's still the underdog in this race just because of how blue Colorado has gotten. I mean, if we just look at the 2020 election, Donald Trump was only able to get 41.9% of the vote. Joe Biden got 55.4% of the vote. And this was a state that Barack Obama back in 2012 only won by about 4 points. So a huge dramatic shift in Colorado in just a short amount of time. The Senate race, which was also coinciding with the presidential race, you saw Cory Gardner, the incumbent, lose, but he didn't lose by nearly as much. He lost by about 9 points, 9.3%, and he got 44.2% of the vote. So again, this was a D+5 environment. Colorado votes to the left of the nation. So Cory Gardner did significantly better than Donald Trump in the state of Colorado, which suggests to me that Colorado is not so much, anti-Republican as it is anti-Trump. Now, Colorado is still a blue state and still rarely votes for Republicans, but generic Republicans do a lot better than Trump and Trump Republicans in the state of Colorado, which is why Democrats are trying to take this risky gamble, because Michael Bennett's been in a number of tough races throughout his Senate career. If we just go back to 2016, for instance, which was a good year for Republicans nationwide, Michael Bennet was able to win by about 6 points, which was pretty good. He overperformed Hillary Clinton's margin in the state. Obviously, incumbency had a little bit of a factor in that. Obviously, he wasn't as controversial as somebody like Hillary Clinton, etc. But if you go back to 2010, Michael Bennet was able to win during a red wave year, the Tea Party wave of 2010, against Ken Buck, who was, I believe, a Tea Party Republican. Now, what's interesting is that in the Democratic primary, Andrew Romanoff, who is a sort of progressive Bernie Sanders-style Democrat, was the one facing Michael Bennet in that primary. Now, if he had won, this race could have had a totally different outcome, but Michael Bennet played his cards right in the general election. Again, this was back when Colorado was much more of a purple state. It was a purple state back in 2010. It voted for Barack Obama in 2008. Wasn't nearly as blue as it is now. So Michael Bennet played his cards right. Obviously, 2016, another tough year. He wins really off of incumbency, and of course, the Republican got as much as 3.5% of the vote taken away by the Libertarians. So that really didn't help him either. But 2022 is going to be another rough year for Republicans in Colorado. Michael Bennet, they have an incumbent already, so that's pretty easy. Michael Bennett's more of a generic Democrat. He opposes Medicare for all. He supports fracking. You have to support fracking in a state like Colorado, which has a lot of oil and natural gas and things like that. But this race in particular, the nominee for the Republicans will really determine how competitive it is. And again, Joe O'Dea, being the more generic, uncontroversial Republican, has much more of a shot at this race than Ron Hanks. Now, one of the ads the Democrats are running online is by a website called hanks2conservative.com. If you literally type in 2022 Colorado Senate race on your phone or something like that, you don't have an ad blocker, this will probably be one of the first links that pops up when you type that in. I know that's how I found this ad. It talks about how conservative is Ron Hanks. Hanks was rated one of the most conservative members of the House. He believes that Joe Biden's election was a fraud, increased access to guns. All these things that are highlighted are basically red meat to the base. Now, this ad is trying to play on reverse psychology. They want Republicans to see this ad when they vote in the primary and, think that they want Ron Hanks as their nominee, because Democrats know that, this is the majority sentiment in the Republican Party still. Wants to ban all abortions. As I talked about earlier, Ron O'Dea's kind of taken a more moderate position on that. Focusing on late-term abortion rather than all abortion, things like that. So he's playing the general election game. But this ad is deliberately made to try and prop up Ron Hanks, who would not win any general election. Now, if you scroll down to the bottom of this ad, it's paid for by Democratic Colorado, which has put, I think, over $1 million into running pro-Ron Hanks ads to try and sway this primary in the other direction, because Ron O'Dea is Joe O'Dea is the front runner in this race by, a decent amount. And this poll was taken about a month ago. The primary is next Tuesday. We'll see how much these Democratic ads play into it. But, if Joe O'Dea is the nominee, Republicans have a much larger shot at potentially flipping this seat. Now, again, I still think it's a long shot, and we'll have to look at a lot of metrics. It's definitely a long shot given how blue Colorado is, but they would get a lot closer with somebody like Joe O'Dea rather than Ron Hanks, and that's why the Democrats want Ron Hanks to win the primary here. Another race we're going to focus on is the Pennsylvania gubernatorial primary. This has already happened, but it's not a secret that Josh Shapiro has propped up Doug Mastriano in his bid to win the nomination. Now, I'm not trying to argue that Doug Mastriano is as unelectable as somebody like Ron Hanks. Pennsylvania is a purple state. We're going into a red wave year. And Mastriano has huge support from the base, massive support from a large percentage of the base. And that's one of the reasons why the only poll we have out of Pennsylvania so far has Mastriano down by 4, but Oz down by 9 points. And again, that's a Suffolk poll. It's a terrible poll. But if there's any validity to it whatsoever, it's that Mastriano is doing slightly better than Oz. And that's probably because he has the base basically united behind him, where Oz doesn't have that luxury. And perhaps I'll make a video on that, in sometime in the future. But Mastriano is definitely a controversial candidate, to say the least. He focused a lot on the 2020 election during his 2022 run for governor. He talked about the failures of Pennsylvania's electoral system in his eyes and things like that. And, he was, in Washington in January of 2021. So, there's just a number of things that are kind of baggage that Democrats kind of seized on. Lou Barletta was a big Trump supporter, but he really didn't talk about January 6th or anything like that. And you didn't really see him vocally focusing in on these very, very controversial issues. Mastriano is pro-life, no exceptions. And, Democrats are hoping that he would be easier to beat in November's election. Now, I think Republicans might luck out this time around, since 2022 is a red wave year. Mastriano, really does have a 50-50 shot, I think, at winning the governor's race here. But I think this backfired on the Democrats a bit, because had the Republican primary played out the way it was going to, first of all, Mastriano could have won anyway. This wasn't all Shapiro's doing, but another candidate could have been nominated that would have had more trouble winning in the general election. Somebody like Lou Barletta, who is a much less controversial candidate, but really isn't much of a campaigner. At least Doug Mastriano is going out and actually campaigning throughout Pennsylvania. Lou Barletta doesn't really campaign that much. He's been described as a lazy campaigner. So that could have been a huge liability as well. But this could be an example where the Democrats could have made an error in calculation. California is another race where we also saw this, and we talked about it earlier on in the video, but David Valadao, who is a Trump impeachment Republican running in a very blue district, the district that Biden won by about 13 points, he was being challenged from the right from a more MAGA Republican. That MAGA Republican ended up losing narrowly, but he got a lot of funding from Democratic organizations because they knew that David Valadao is an extremely strong electoral force in the district. I mean, he won by a pretty large margin in a Biden 11 district, back in 2020. So the fact that he was able to unseat an incumbent in a district that Biden won by 11 points, he's currently representing the bluest district in the country for a Republican to represent. So he gets some leeway on some of the positions he's taken. And ultimately, he's going to advance the general election, and he's very likely to win by a decent amount come November. Now, finally, I want to focus in on the Illinois governor's race, because this is a race that could be mildly competitive. Again, Illinois, if we just go back in history real quick, 2014, Republicans won this race by about 4 points against an incumbent. 2010, Republicans narrowly lost this race. So Illinois overall, despite, some blue and red wave years, is very competitive for Republicans on the gubernatorial level, because Republicans run more moderate candidates, and turnout is very different downstate compared to upstate. In 2014, Cook County's turnout and the Chicago suburbs was pretty low. Turnout was sky high in the rural areas, and that's one of the reasons why Bruce Rauner was actually able to beat Pat Quinn back in 2014. And he actually moved to the left after he won the general election on a number of issues like abortion and things like that. So he actually was campaigning more conservative in the general, won, and then actually moved to the left when in office, hoping he'd get reelected, and that didn't work out too well for him. Mainly because it was a blue wave year, and he lost a huge segment of the Republican base in rural downstate to third-party candidates. So looking ahead at 2022, there's a number of candidates vying for the Republican nomination for governor. Currently, Darren Bailey is leading. The latest poll has him tied with Jesse Sullivan. Jesse Sullivan's a pretty well-spoken, conservative. He's more of an evangelical type. Darren Bailey, though, reminds me of sort of an Obama-era, old-fashioned Southern Republican. Has the Southern drawl, very, very evangelical. And right off the bat, you can tell he's not electable in a blue state like Illinois. Remotely, he's not at all electable. Richard Irvin is, a social liberal, fiscal conservative, sort of in the mold of Mark Kirk, the former Republican senator, and Bruce Rauner to a lesser extent. He was leading in the primary early on, but Darren Bailey sort of took the lead, and Democrats have been putting a lot of money behind Darren Bailey, hoping he wins the primary, knowing that Again, he's a pretty weak candidate to go up against J.B. Pritzker in the general. Sure, he would do very well downstate, but in the Chicago suburbs would have gotten obliterated. So, this is another example where Democrats are actively trying to, sabotage a race that Republicans would otherwise have a much better shot at winning, because if you're the Democratic Party, you're trying to mitigate the losses that you're going to get in other places. So you want to be able to put more money in states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, instead of putting money in a state like Illinois or Colorado, which is why they're trying to do this, because the Republican candidates that are the most electable could actually make these races decently competitive, which is why you're seeing so much money being spent in Republican primaries. And, J.B. Pritzker is running, I think, essentially unopposed. He's running against a no-name Democrat. But, Democrats have more money to spend than the Republicans here. There is no competitive primary for the Democrats in this race, as with Colorado. So they're able to put a lot of money into the Republican primary to try and prop up the most hard-right candidate in the primary who, in Illinois, in Colorado, which are both pretty blue states, would not win any general election, even in a red wave year. Anyway, guys, thank you all for watching this video. Please leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed. Subscribe to the channel. Hit the bell notification so you don't miss any more videos I put out. And as always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.